a little bit stretched because we want to be the best in Africa. Yeah, this is our function. I don't think it's really necessary to go through, but this is our function as per Act 10 of 2027. Next, can we move a little faster because I know this is we have a long presentation. Yeah, basically, we as a country, we are talking about two networks. We have the meter gauge with more than 2,700 kilometers, and then we have the standard gauge. Currently, we are around 2,000, but we have a long way to go. But basically, as a country, we aim to go up to 4,700 kilometers. That's the network within the country. Next. Yeah. Those are the progress. You know, as we speak, you're aware that the government is already embarked in construction since 2017. So the first part is from Dar es Salaam all the way to Mwanza. And Mwanza we are aiming for Uganda. Of course, apart from serving the regional within Tanzania, but really, I always say to my Uganda friends, you know, we have the CEO, Managing Director of Uganda. This is their railway, really. We are aiming for Uganda. And we are going to have a collaboration with our friends in Uganda. And we don't see the reason why they should not have their own training all the way from Port Belly or from Kampala all the way to Dar es Salaam. But that's the whole line is under construction. Then we have from Tabora to Kigoma. That's also is under construction. And currently we're under procurement from Uvinza, somewhere between Tabora and Kigoma. We are branching from Uvinza to Malagarasi, then all the way to Burundi, Msongati. So we expect to have the contractor within 2 months. Yeah, but that is the development. The amount of investment, we are talking around more than $10 million US. That's a huge investment. It's a mega project by definition. Whether it's here in Tanzania, you take it to Europe, or you take it to America, see the mega project. But really, as I said, we as a country, because of our geographical position, to be able to leverage our geographical position, connecting Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, obviously, you know, the investment in SGR is really necessary. It's a game changer, actually, when you're talking, you know, if you're talking about, you know, logistics within East and Central Africa. Okay. These are the, can we next? So, the aim of the whole of this transformation within the railway sector, the aim is to increase efficiency, but reduce cost, reduce government dependence. Now, I think the central corridor, the representative central corridor, he said something about, you know, efficiency in terms of using time, and of efficiency in terms of cost. We are very sure that with the coming of standard gauge, we'll be able to reduce significantly the logistic cost in totality, because you see, logistics it's like a system. You're talking about the storage cost, and also time, but also the time of moving your freight from point 1 to point B. So we're really looking for that, you know, by the introduction of the standard gauge and the rehabilitation is going on for meter gauge, the aim is to reduce the transaction cost within the economy. But the next. Yeah, and let's take us to private sector. participation, because obviously, really for the private sector, those two parties is really very important. Because private sector, they're coming, they want to do business. Obviously, they're looking, apart from giving services, but to be sustainable, they have to be efficient. But also they have to cut, to cut down costs so that they can be able to be sustainable as a company. So next, can we move a little faster? Yeah, those is still the same thing we're saying, just next. Now, these are the opportunities, because that's the aim of this forum. Basically, if you look on the opportunity, we are talking about the construction side. We are still looking for private, PPP participation. In terms of the construction, we have line from Mtwara all the way to Liganga, Mchuchuma, then to Nyasa, which connect actually, it's not just Tanzania, but we are connecting Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia. So this is the regional project. And we'll see the number later. But also in terms of the opportunity for operations, this is for open access. Can you go back? Can you sit there? Yeah, this is the open access. We've shown you about the possibility of open access. So you can have your own train, then you use your truck, you pay concession fee, so you're in business. And this is also for my fellow from Uganda. You don't to think about billions of dollars to construct a new railway. You see, by just investing in rolling stock, you are in business. So basically, for Uganda, really, you need to construct maybe around 11 kilometers from Port Belly to Kampala. You're in business. Yeah, so maintenance, obvious, because we are going to have a private operators, different as an institution, we are looking on the possibility of how the private sector can participate in maintaining our track to make more efficient. We have the real estate management. This is a new thing for we, especially in Africa, because most of our railway really were designed by German colonial. Their aim was to move whatever raw material from point A to point B. That's from the production side or the farms all the way to the port. But they didn't really think about the railway as a community. Now, if we learn from our brothers, or from other countries which are much more developed, the real estate is a key when you're talking about a railway. Because most of the railways, we always see, they are well developed. They're more sustainable themselves. They don't depend on subsidies from government. They use very well when it comes to the real estate. And that's why when you look on our designing for our station, they are a little bit bigger. Maybe they're not as big as Asia or maybe in Europe, but we are making so that when you go there, you don't need to have a train to see people working or walking. So we are turning to be a little bit like a business center. So whether there's a train, you see people are doing transactions. So we're going to have banks, we're going to have mini supermarkets, we're going to have restaurants, we are going to have small shops. People, they can, they are able to do business. And this is, our aim is to make sure that we leverage our real estate, because obvious for the railway, real estate is a big thing. And if you, our experience, talking to some of our colleagues, out of 100%, almost between 25 to 40% of their total revenue are coming from real estate. And this is really very important for us. And we as CLC, we are going to push to make sure that this has become significant when we are talking about the contribution to our revenue. Then we have a provision of rolling stock. This is also a big opportunity for the private sector to come in. Currently, we are just started, but we're almost not even 20% of what we need. So this is a big opportunity for private sector to come in. Okay, next. Oh, okay, they say, can you go back? There's also a workshop, airport inquiries. Also, you know, we are inviting for private sector to be able to communicate. We'll be able to, if for those who will be interested, we know we have some of, you know, who are interested. We'll have a more detailed discussion on those areas. Okay, next. And then you have the intercity. Okay, so I've spoken about Control Road Day. Can you move? Those are the figures, actually. Now we have another, you know, line about Tanga, Arusha, Msoma line. That is also, we are looking for private investors to come in. Those are the figures. But all of this, actually, we have the feasibility study. It's already done. Maybe some of the feasibility study we need to upgrade it, but most of the, you know, all of these are, we have already done the feasibility study. But next. These are the lines, opportunities. I was talking about the construction side of it. Kaliua, Mpanda, Kalema. That's the Kalema. That's the port on the other side of Tanzania. Then the other side is Kalemie for DRC. Next. We have Isaka Lusumo. That's okay. Isaka Lusumo. That is another line. That's connecting from Isaka all the way to Kigali. The feasibility study is done, and we are looking for private sector participation. Now, construction and commuter train. I know that some of you know, we have some investors here who we are working with them now. They're interested on this, but these are the opportunities. Not just for Dar es Salaam, but we have it for Dodoma. Dodoma is already, you know, we have the feasibility study already. But we are looking forward for Dar es Salaam, our business city, apart from BRT, but also we want to have you know, a seated train. And that is it makes a lot of sense, because by 2050, we are expecting to have more than maybe more than 20 million people living in Dar es Salaam. It's impossible to move them by lot. This is the more sustainable solution, you know, for our cities. And I'm not just talking about Dar es Salaam. When we have a feasibility study now for Dodoma, but we are looking forward for Arusha. We'll have also the feasibility study for Mwanza here, but also for Mbeya. Those are the cities which are growing very fast. And we need to be there as early as much as possible, because all the construction is going very fast. Okay, next. Now, I've already touched about the operation maintenance in terms of open access. And I'm sure we have some companies who are interested already. And I'm sure some of you maybe will be interested, then we'll be able to go with you in detail. But as I said in my remarks, we are currently working on regulation, but the law is, you know, Her Excellency has already signed, you know, signed into a law, open access. So it's not really something we are trying to discuss here. It's the preparation for, you know, where we are going. So definitely we are going to engage the private sector, and our board of chairmen, you explained very well, why do we need open access? You know, it's not like you are coming to compete with us, but more, you know, complementing us to be able to utilize our capacity. And next. Those are the potentials when it comes to cargo. The projection is that by 2029, 2030, which is really very close, we are expecting Dar es Salaam port to hit 30.013 million tonnage. And that is almost 50% of that is Trans-Chicago. That is opportunity, really opportunity. And that is outside of, you know, the potential for minorities from Burundi, DRC, and within Tanzania. So the potential is huge. Yeah, as I started, you know, we are working both on the MGR and CGR. And the boys, you see their capacity, the MGR and the SGR, that is their capacity. But obviously, that is the minimum capacity. With the loops we have increased, it goes almost twice of that capacity. Yeah. Next. I've already mentioned about the operation maintenance opportunities and the intention of we as TLC to work closely with private sector, making sure that this new system, it's a system, the railway we are, you know, we are investing to enhance efficiency as much as possible for the betterment of our country. Next, the real estate I've already mentioned. What is but those are the areas, you know, of participation. Arusha, we have a huge area. I'm not sure if you have some people coming from Arusha here. We are the one of the, you know, institution which owns huge area within at the middle of the city. Morogoro, the same thing. You know, you're welcome. We have more than acres just around our station. As a country, in terms of polls, at the top, you know, that is the way to go. Private sector participation, as I said, to put a conducive environment for private sector to be able to do business. And we are sure when you are talking about logistics in totality, SGR is a game changer for within Eastern, even to the SADC. And Tanzania, we've been pushing a little bit, you know, hard, because if you look on the, in terms of Africa in general, we're more around 4,400 kilometers under construction. And almost 40%, almost close to more 35% is in Tanzania. That is, we are much more aggressive, and also tells a lot when it comes to geographical position we are, because we are not just talking about Tanzania, but also we are thinking about our neighbors, you know, how they are able to, apart from using our port, but how they are able to cut down costs, you know, to be able to build their country. So we really welcome the private sector, financial institution, which some of them we already, you know, we are cooperating with them. But for the new one, we welcome you to TLC. We are going to be here today, and I'll be here today, tomorrow. But even after, you know, going back to Dar es Salaam and Dodoma, you are still welcome to knock your door. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Asante DG. After the corridor presentation and yours, the picture is becoming a lot clearer. Sindio jamani, eh? Yeah? So we're looking at moving to
mbele na matangazo haya ya moja kwa moja, na kikubwa zaidi katika kongamano hili kubwa la kibiashara ambalo linaangalia kwa kimsingi fursa za biashara na uwekezaji katika reli nchini Tanzania. Wapo wawasilishaji wa mada mbalimbali, na mada ya kwanza ikiwa imewasilishwa na mkurugenzi mtendaji wa shirika la reli nchini Tanzania TRC, na kwa hivi sasa yeye akijaribu kuangalia pia fursa nyingi ambazo zipo katika eneo hili, na hivi sasa ni wasaa wa wasilishaji mwingine ili kuweza kuangalia yale ambayo yapo katika sekta hii ya usafirishaji nchini Tanzania. Bado tupo katika ukumbi huu wa Malaika Resort hapa Ilemela jijini Mwanza.
So he's the Director of Infra Advisory Services Private Limited and a technical specialist in the Office of the Director General of the National Treasury of South Africa. Until January of this year, he was the Chief Executive Officer, the Gautrain Management Agency, which is the owner of the assets of the Gautrain Rapid Rail Link, a US dollars 3.5 billion urban rail PPP. He joined the agency in 2010 and served as the Chief Operating Officer between 2014 to 2020. That's substantial years. And prior to his time at the Gautrain, William was the head of the Public-Private Partnership Unit at the South African National Treasury and was also the unit's founding member since the year 2000. I think I can go on. We're happy to have you. Thank you for your patience, and we are anxious to hear from you. Karibu sana. Most welcome. Please proceed, if you can hear me.
Thank you, Master Service. Yes, I can. Can I just check whether I'm audible or not?
You're very audible, and you're also very clear.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation to join this august forum. And I wish I was there. Unfortunately, circumstances prevented me from attending in person. But what I would like to do is share my presentation with you, which I have titled A South African Experience in terms of our private participation in rail. So again, let me just check, is my screen visible to everyone?
Yes, it is. Please proceed.
Great, thank you. So I've titled this Private Sector Participation in Rail, a South African Perspective. And as you very kindly introduced me, Master of Ceremonies, I am the ex-CEO of the Gautrain Management Agency, which is the agency which has the largest rail concession, passenger rail concession in Africa. And I'll be pleased to share a case study on that. But my presentation is going to be in 5 parts. I'm going to quickly take you through the South African rail context, talk to some of the challenges we have in the rail sector, and I'm sure you will find many similarities with Tanzania, opportunities in the rail sector, how we view these in South Africa, to talk about private sector participation, and then to take you all through the Gautrain case study. So by way of context, in South Africa, we have a very long, and it's a colonial history of rail. It dates back to the 1860s, and it had to do with the discovery of minerals in the interior of the country, and the need, as every country has, is how to move minerals and freight from mine to port. And that led to a boom in rail construction. But what is different in South Africa is just the scale of that early construction. 22,000 kilometers of rail was constructed.
Recording in progress.
Within 60 years. And 2 interesting little snips of information, that if you added up the turnover of all the rail operators in the country in 1920, it made up 8% of the national GDP, and 40% of all government employees were railway workers. Now that's very important, because I think what that is embedded in our DNA as a country is that rail is very important to our economy, but it's in essence a government service. And many of these employees over the years, right up until the early 2000s, viewed themselves as civil servants, not necessarily as people working for rail companies. Then back to the history lesson, back in the 1930s, the government had an idea. They passed the Rail Act, and you could not transport freight on road unless you had a permit. They forced freight onto rail, and you can imagine the consequences of that. In the 1980s, there was deregulation. It reversed this, and immediately there's a sharp movement of general freight business to moving to road. And especially that became more and more efficient as the national road network grew in the country. Then we have two lines that are dedicated, the iron ore line and the bulk coal lines. All they do is they transport these ore and coal commodities from mine to port. This is a snapshot of what the network looks like. You'll see, as of today, we still have 22,000 kilometers of rail. It's not necessarily the same kilometers, but it's pretty much the same absolute total number. Of the total 22,400, probably around 6,000, 67,000 actually in use at the moment. The bulk mineral corridors, the one in the west of the country takes iron ore to port, and the coal lines are on the east side of the country. The blue line carries general freight and some tanzanite, some other ores, and the green and the grey lines are essentially what we call the branch lines, very, very low utilization. And then right at the bottom, it's not even on the scale of this map, is 80 kilometers of standard gauge regional rapid rail. That's the Gautrain. All of the other are Cape or narrow gauge lines. In the 90s, there was a change, there was a corporatization, and the old South African Railways and Harbours was corporatized into Transnet, which is a state-owned enterprise. So immediately then, Transnet then devolved all of passenger rail to another agency called PRASA, Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, and they run metro rail in 5 city regions and mainline passenger services between cities, or at least they did until COVID decimated that service, and at the moment there's no mainline passenger service anymore. But what Transnet also did was it created subsidiaries for port operations and port management and for freight rail. But it never devolved these, it always kept control of them. And what was interesting was that because of that lack of separation of powers, a lot of cross-subsidization happened, which I'll come to in a moment. Then, in 2006, the Gauteng provincial government, we are a federal system, we have provincial as well as state governments. The Gauteng provincial government created the Gautrain using a PPP model, and that's the 80 kilometers of rapid rail urban transport, linking the airport and the 3 metros in the province. Now, just to confuse everyone even more, I'm not sure if it's as confusing in Tanzania, but we have different reporting lines. So Transnet reports to the Department of Public Enterprises, which is not transport related, it just looks after all the SOEs. PRASA, the passenger rail people, they report to the National Department of Transport, and Gautrain reports to the Gauteng provincial government. Some of the challenges in the rail sector, well, if we look around the world, we'll see that the worldwide use of rail for freight or in passenger transport has increased. And if you look at the graphic on the screen, using the index of 1 in 2000, around the world, the total rail freight has nearly doubled. It's at 1.8. In South Africa, it is not. It is just 9% above where it was in 2000. And that declining from 2020 to 2022, I think we can summarize in a few core reasons. The first is underinvestment in rail. If we look at the amount of investment that there should have been in keeping up our network to modern standards, that simply has not happened. Secondly, there have been vague and unfunded state mandates. This is where the state, through its shareholder, comes in and says, we want you to do A instead of B. And a classic example of that would be running heavily subsidized mainline passenger services to the detriment of urban rail, for example. Then a conglomerate approach where, as I'd indicated, Transnet was never ever unbundled. There's no vertical separation. There's no ability to distinguish where money is being made and being lost. So to give you an indication of how bad it was, ports typically made a profit in South Africa. that was then used, instead of reinvesting in port infrastructure in Transnet, was moved over to some of the less profitable rail lines, which, as any business person in the room will know, is not a good approach to running a business. Then, uncompetitive market. I think this is where Transnet, as a monopoly, certainly the only entity able to run rail and ports, behaved as a monopoly and excluded competition. And yes, that may have helped them in the short run, but you'll see in the last 2 to 3 years it's not helped, and neither has poor governance, to which I would add a large element of corruption around large tenders for rolling stock locomotives, etc. But if you go and have a look at this in a little bit more detail, you'll see that the, so we map this in this graphic over the last 100 years, you will see the effect from 1930 to 1980, where it was a regulated environment. You had to transport your goods by rail. That moved the general freight business and iron ore and coal all the way up to a peak of sort of 150 to 200 million tons if you add them all together. But immediately deregulation came into place, that dropped down. At the bottom of the graph, you'll see the coal and the iron ore increased up until sort of 2016, 2017, and then took a marked drop. But the scary thing is, look at the GDP of the country in that dotted line and how rail has failed to support the economic growth trajectory of the country. Our ports are ranked in the bottom 10% by the World Bank, measured by performance, and economists estimate that we forfeited about $27 billion US dollars in not being able to take advantage of the commodity boom of the last 10 to 15 years. From a passenger rail point of view, COVID had a very big impact on passenger rail. Passengers left the mode and assets were lost to vandalism. So it's not a pretty picture when you look at the challenges. So where did the freight and passengers go to? And here's another graphic, and I have shared the presentation. You're welcome to have a look at this. All of this data comes from the National Department of Transport and the Presidency, so it's open data. But you'll see what happened then was it was a shift from rail to road. So underinvestment in rail resulted in increased private investment in road haulage. So if you have a look at the graphics here, you'll see that again from an index of 1 in 2007, 72% more an increase in investment in heavy trailers. These are massive trailers to bring ore on road. And you will see similarly across all these road-based ones. But the bottom line, the black line, that's our investment in locomotives in the country, which has declined by 33%. And that leads to massive inefficiency. Now, because I always prefer a picture to a graph, I think this sums up the state of our freight rail system at the moment, having moved into road. On the top right, this is a recent picture of someone trying to haul via these heavy trailers on a provincial road with axle weights well in excess of the road load-bearing capacity, damaging the road. And the bottom left picture is the N4, a national road at the Mozambique border. The queue of trucks waiting to get to port at Maputo is reportedly over 50 kilometers long. And you can imagine the impact on the economy from this. All right, let's try and be a little bit more cheerful about this. What are the opportunities? And this is where I'm very happy to say that over the last 3 years, we have changed our policy approach in South Africa. After many, many years of inactivity, we now have a national rail policy and a national rail bill. And it's looking at 3 critical areas. The first is vertical separation in Transnet, so to unbundle Transnet from this conglomerate. Number 2 is to allow third-party access onto the rail network, enforced and regulated by an independent economic rail regulator. And then thirdly, devolution of passenger rail functions to the metros, that's the cities and the provinces. And all of this to also, through that level playing field, to allow private sector participation. The presidency has set up crisis committees and private and public sector participation in freight and passenger rail. There's a freight rail roadmap, which I'll talk a little bit about, but in essence it maps out a way we can get out of this mess that we're in. Then we are developing a national rail master plan, which really is to reconstruct our strategic rail network, to move away from the 22,000 kilometers that we can't manage into a much more cost-effective core network. From a passenger rail point of view, to move to 650 million passenger trips per annum and 1 billion by 2050, to increase the modal share of rail freight to 25%, and to align infrastructure investment to introduce competition into the rail market and attract private sector participation and their investment, and then to look at high-speed rail corridors and long-distance passenger rail services again. This is the National Department of Transport map. I think they've done very, very well. It just maps out this 25-year plan which we have. The only thing that I will point out here that I think is very important and a big development is that the National Department of Transport has passed a private sector participation framework and is busy recruiting experts to serve in a PSP task team in the department. So how can the private sector participate? So I've identified 4 basic forms for freight in rail. So number 1, third-party access without investment in fixed infrastructure. So this is where the private sector would own or lease rolling stock and use available slots from the infrastructure manager that's in a vertically separated transnet, and they would pay an access charge. That access charge would be determined, first of all, in a network statement, but later on by the economic regulator when they come on board. Number 2, third-party access with investment in fixed motors, wagons, and electric multiple units to public and private operators. For passenger rail, our model would be one of concession of new or existing rail corridors. And here, the only working model in South Africa is the Gautrain, which I'll talk about later. Transnet did tender out access to rail lines, but those tenders were not market friendly and they largely failed, and hence the intervention by national government to try and drive this more progressively. There is one contract for a Durban port terminal awarded last year to a company called International Container Terminal Services. It's a 25-year joint venture, and hopefully that will bear fruit in the coming years. To then talk quickly about private sector participation overall, in South Africa we have a strong PPP framework. We have 131 projects, around $30 billion of capital value, but it's dominated by the renewable energy sector projects. And if you look at the graphic on the top right, in terms of the number of projects and the amount of investment, energy and electricity is far ahead of railways, coming in at a distant second. In the transport sector, we have 4 toll roads and the Gautrain. The graphic on the bottom shows when we did these projects, and you'll see that we've been very active in the country since 2010 onwards, and we have developed a good basis of expertise in PPPs. To then move to my last part of the presentation, I want to share with you my experience on the Gautrain. But before I do that, I think people in the room will realize some of the characteristics and recognize some of the characteristics of public transport. Number 1, public transport, especially rail-based public transport, is very capital intensive. It has very high operating costs, and there's a limited ability or willingness to pay, and that's across the world. But especially in developing countries, people can't afford the full cost recovery, cost of good public transport systems. Therefore, there's the high likelihood of subsidy. And that's why the economic impact and the fiscal risk need to be carefully analyzed. And I say this in my new role as advising in the National Treasury. You can't just go and do a whole bunch of projects because somebody says there's a good likelihood of economic impact. There has to be a thorough analysis of these impacts and risks. And it must have a wider impact on the economy and society than just being a rail project. And I know rail people don't like to hear this, but remember, we're competing against a whole range of other economic investment projects. We have to show our case. And this is where Gauteng is interesting, because Gauteng was never put forward as a transport project alone. It was put forward and proposed way back in 2003, 2004 as an economic investment and an economic growth project that would stimulate new development and job creation. The other elements, of course, were transport-related, restructuring urban areas, city sustainability, and promoting public transport, promoting small businesses, tourism, etc. To give you some of the details about the project, it's a greenfield urban rapid rail project, 80 kilometers with 10 stations linking the 3 cities in Gauteng and the airport. It is a PPP. It's a concession agreement of the design, build, finance, operate, maintain, and transfer. And what's interesting, it's signed in 2006 and it ends in April 2026, which is only 2 years away. These are some images of it for those of you who have not. Had a massive economic impact, 20 billion rand during construction and 1.7 billion rand per annum during operations. Created around 11,000 direct jobs and 61,000 indirect jobs. And you'll see that as the population of our cities grows, this need for urban transportation, rail transportation grows stronger and stronger. Talking about the Gauteng as a PPP, we're one of the first passenger rail concessions ever in the world. I think we were 7th, if my memory serves right, when we signed the agreement in 2006. Capital cost around $3.5 billion US, making it one of the largest greenfield PPP rail projects in the world. It's also very interesting because of its age. It's now completed its 5-year construction period up until 2011-2012, and has 12 years of full operation. It's coming to the end of concession, and it's one of the very few PPP projects to go through the full life cycle of design, build, operate, and now the transfer stage. Transported, as I said, 200 million train and bus passengers to these fantastic service standards. But it's a very contractual arrangement. It involves multiple parties, funders and financiers, over 53 separate but interlinked contracts. As you can just imagine the complexity to manage over 19.5 years of planning, construction, and operation. So the project preparation, the work that went into this was enormous. And it took a lot of collaboration between the province, the National Treasury, and the Department of Transport. We also, I can't say we anymore, I've left there now, but it is the first rail PPP project to reach reconcessioning in the world. So there's a very exciting phase of that which is happening. These are our partners. That's the provincial logo. The Gauteng provincial government signed a PPP agreement with Bombela. Bombela has the shareholders at the bottom, in the beginning international players, Bombardier and Bouygues, as well as local investors, and the operators from France, RATP Development. In terms of timelines, and I think if Tanzania is looking at PSP in a meaningful way, please start planning now, because these things take a long time. From the feasibility study in April 2000 to financial close was around 5.5, 6 years. Around 6 years to build. So in total, from start to ribbon cutting is 10 years. So we have to be thinking well ahead of the curve. And we're in the operations and maintenance phase now. Very importantly, I'll touch on it briefly. And again, it's crucial in developing countries. Rail projects must have targeted socioeconomic development. And in the Gautrain, we formalize this. We contract with Bombella, the private party, for 22 components of socio-economic development. Things like job creation, who they buy materials from, a whole training, women employment, employment of people with disabilities, all of these socially important elements. As a result of that, over 6 billion rands, South African rands, have been invested.
Our hands together to Mr. William. And since he's online, let us allow a couple of questions, quick, rapid-fire questions to you. And we'll let you take note of them and then quickly answer those, as we may not have you in the near future, in the next 1 or 2 hours. And so we'd like to make good use of you as an expert resource. Ladies and gentlemen, questions, please.
Ni akibainisha ni kwa namna gani wajasiriamali hapa nchini Tanzania wanaweza wakawekeza huko katika sekta hii adhimu ya usafirishaji, ili pengine kuweza kupata mafanikio makubwa kama ilivyo kule nchini Afrika ya Kusini, ambapo kwa maelezo yake ni kwamba kule kuna mafanikio makubwa sana. Tusikilize sasa baadhi ya maswali kutoka kwa washiriki katika kongamano hili.
vis-a-vis freight trains. Yeah.
Much more, it's much easier in terms of scheduling when freight gets moved. There's much more ability to transfer risk to a private sector concessionaire. They know and understand the freight market. Whereas in passenger rail, especially with the lessons we learned around COVID, there's a massive, massive difference in terms of demand risk. So we in South Africa, and I didn't have time to mention this, in the reconcessioning of the Gautrain from a passenger rail point of view, will not seek to transfer demand risk to the private sector, whereas in the freight rail sector, there would most definitely be the transfer of any form of demand risk on the freight. The other interesting difference is that I don't think that in passenger rail concessioning we'll be able to move to a vertically separated system just yet. In other words, concessions would be for the per way as well as for rolling stock, station management, etc. They would be integrated concessions. Whereas the most likely route that we would go on the freight one is that Transnet would typically remain infrastructure manager, and the private sector concessionaires would be required to upgrade maybe certain elements of the infrastructure, but their focus would be on rolling stock, terminals at start and the endpoints at the port, and that type of investment. So yes, there certainly would be differences between the two of them. There's also a big difference in terms of the revenue sources. As I'd said, passenger rail is a subsidized service, so there would most likely be an element of different subsidies coming together to pay the concessionaire and passenger rail, as well as the fare revenue that they collect, whereas again in freight we would not be looking for any form of public sector subsidy. I think those are sort of the highlight differences that come immediately to mind.
All right, thank you, William. Please, let's look at the hands. We have a hand here, and I'll bring a mic to you. Karibu sana. Please introduce yourself very quickly and then launch into your question.
Thank you very much, moderator. My name is Abubakar Ochaki. I'm the Chief Operating Officer, Uganda Railways Corporation. My question, sir, is one. We have seen concessions failing, railway concessions failing in East Africa. In Tanzania, its concession with the Indian rights failed within the first 2 or 3 years. In Kenya, it failed within the 10 years. In Uganda, it failed within the same period, 10 years. What is that special stuff have you done to have your concession successful in South Africa? But also through your experience in the industry, why do you think these concessions have failed in our setup? And maybe the last question is, what would be your personal or guidance if African states have to get back into these concessions? What is it, 1 or 2, 3 stuff that we have to do to have it right again? Thank you very much.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I'm going to start off by answering with a plea. And my plea is this. We in Africa love to do things differently in our own countries. We never buy collectively. We never contract collectively. Yet if you look at rail, its most important characteristic, certainly in an African perspective, is its ability to cross borders. Yet we in South Africa, we bought our trains. Bombardier was the supplier. You look around, I think Ethiopia's purchased some Chinese rolling stock. We ourselves have some Chinese stuff. It's bits and pieces all over the place. One of the reasons then that leads to failure in a concession environment is that we don't look at cross-border opportunities and growing the scale of these concessions to a point of view where maybe they become more commercially viable. That would be my first plea and response. The second is maybe I think that we tend to under-prepare our projects before they go to market. We rush them. We're always under this pressure, and that's why I was indicating these timelines. We have to be thinking 10 years ahead, and we have to invest in the project preparation and the advisors that we get. The third reason that I would give is I think that in Africa we suffer from a lack of competition. So I'll give you the Gauteng example. So we went out in 2004 to this massive international bidding process. You know, it was a real roadshow. We had the president, the premiers, all the ministers there. We invited each country to send their potential investors. And they all came to the bidding conference. But at the end of the day, when we opened the tender box, there were only two bids in the box. And I suspect, I don't know how true this is in those examples that you gave, I suspect that there wasn't strong competition in the market for these concessions. So one of the things that we should be addressing is, have we got our market conditions right? Or are we subject to very limited, uncompetitive bidding that might lead to contracts that are kind of set up for failure? But I think those would be, again, sort of the thoughts that come to my mind. It would be very interesting to, maybe before I, one topic which is really, really important as well is the amount of effort that goes into managing these concessions. You know, in South Africa, when we sign concession agreements, that transaction advisors leave, all the experts leave, and the government officials are left relatively junior managing this massively complex arrangement. We did not make that mistake on Gauteng. We set up this management agency. It has around 110 staff members, experts in rail, expert in law, expert in a range of things that work for the government. And that acts in the concession. So there's been many disputes in the Gauteng, many opportunities maybe for there to be some sort of a disaster and a termination of the concession. But we worked through each one of these issues with the concessionaire. We resolved them, and we were a very strong contracting party on the public sector side. So I think that's a very concrete lesson learned that I can share from the Gauteng.
Okay, we have a bit of a feedback. So let's see if we can wrap up in about 5 minutes or so, as we're moving behind time. The next hand is Madam Chair.
Yeah, thank you, moderator. I'd like to have a question to Mr. William. According to your presentation, you have mentioned most of the projects that you have implemented in PPP, and only Gautrain, when it comes to railway, has been implemented. Why do you think you don't have long-distance train implemented in PPP mode? Because we receive investors from South Africa who shows interest to invest in Tanzania using PPP, but we haven't seen any project in terms of its massive 100 kilometers plus implemented in South Africa. Second question, Gautrain contract is coming to an end. 2 years to come, they are supposed to transfer according to your contract. What mode are you going to engage another operator? Are you going to engage an open access operator, or again you are going to use a PPP, and why?
Thank you for those questions. Are you okay with the feedback there? I can hear some feedback in the room.
We're good.
You're good. All right. Thank you. So the first to do with long distance rail. I think this was a service that literally fell between the cracks, and you'll have seen it in my slides in the 1990s when Transnet focused entirely on freight, and it passed over to the passenger rail agency, the metro rail systems, as well as the long distance ones. But Transnet themselves were the people who owned the locomotives that would haul these long distance trains. And Prasa never focused on them properly. They would run some services, I think, inefficiently and overpriced, and they deliberately, I think, ignored the potential for private sector concessioning in that. In their defense, I think one of the complexities that there is that these long distance services run over both Prasa and Transnet rail lines at a time, and different traction power systems, at a time when Transnet itself hadn't figured out how to get open access sorted. One of the moves that we've got to have as a country now is how we reopen that up. And I must tell you, it's a very tough environment, because you'll know this, if you run any distance longer than sort of 500-600 kilometers, airlines tend to be more competitive. Anything less than that, you still need to be competing against private car and buses. So it's a very competitive market. I think we in South Africa should have taken the opportunity of introducing these concessions even some 20 years ago. We did not, and that is probably why South African investors are now looking towards Tanzania. What we are looking at quite aggressively, though, is in terms of a high-speed corridor. And our planning shows that between Johannesburg and Durban, there's a strong potential for a high-speed rail network. This is where we're talking in excess of 300 kilometers per hour top speed trains moving. And hopefully that would allow us to sort of leapfrog that technology, a very ambitious plan. The second question there was around what mode we would use for post-2026. We did look at an open access possibility, but there's two fundamental reasons why we didn't go that route, and instead we went the full operating concession route. The first is that we are standard gauge. So we are the only 80 kilometers in the whole of the country, and probably in SADC, I would guess, that has standard gauge. So to have an open access approach would probably not work. You know, the hurdle to enter would be going and buying rolling stock that could run on a standard gauge system and not anywhere else in the country. The second reason is just in terms of the scale. So we've got 80 kilometers of network and 10 stations, and it doesn't make sense in this environment to have open access. The bigger plan, though, is to add in another 150 kilometers of standard gauge network across the province. And then an open access approach will probably work. And what we would do is we would concession out the infrastructure manager part and then allow for operating licenses or operating concessions to operate on those lines.
Oh goodness. You want to have a repeat question? Can I give you a minute? Did you ask your question? You didn't. So you have the mic with you. Oh, please do. Yes. I thought you'd already.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams, for your nice presentation. Mine is like just a follow-up question, because I wanted to ask the same question which has been asked by previous, by the Honorable Madam Chair. You are saying that in South Africa you have been opening tendering for the PPP. Is there any legal framework which can allow having a PPP without a tendering process, which has been taken to be too long? Or if it is through tendering, is there any legal framework which can shorten the process to have a successful PPP? Thank you.
And again, a very good question. So the short answer is yes. There is a way in which you can avoid, well, not avoid, that's not the right word, but to allow private sector participation to come in outside of the formal tendering process, and that's known as unsolicited proposals. What had happened in the past is that the requirements for this unsolicited proposal were so difficult that no one ever tried to do such a proposal. One of the reforms which we're working on in the National Treasury is to change that framework, that unsolicited proposals can be accepted. But please, this is where there's a very, very important element of this. Good practice and constitutional requirements say there must be fair, transparent, and competitive processes. So someone somewhere may come along and say, hang on, that unsolicited proposal wasn't good value, I could have done it better. So what the new framework, which is being put out for unsolicited proposals, said that the private sector may come in, may make an unsolicited proposal, may develop the business case from it, but that business case still goes to an open market so that anyone else who wants to compete and show that they could offer better value than the proponent is able to do so. And I think that's very good in the long term in terms of making sure, as I said, that we keep competition going, but also that both South Africa and Tanzania, if you're looking at unsolicited proposals, has got a solid framework that people say we know the risks that we're taking if we're putting in an unsolicited bid, not to just rush and try and sign with the first people who come along.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, may we please put our hands together to Mr. William. I believe he's been a fantastic resource. We have an app for the forum. It's called Summit Point. Maybe we could send you the details. Some of the delegates may wish to have further questions. There's a chat option within the app. It will also allow you to follow the proceedings. They may be able to engage with you further.
Wonderful. I look forward to that. Thank you.
And I understand that you still have about an hour with us, so if you're still there, you may hear some of the other speakers that are coming through before we go to lunch. But we'd like to thank you very much. Those hands were for you. Thank you for being a fantastic resource to this forum. Appreciate it. Asante sana. So, Honorable Minister, distinguished delegates, we have 30 minutes before lunch, and I had made a proposal to the organizing committee. Is my proposal agreed on? Do you think it's a good idea? I was proposing that we bring on the next two presenters and then we go to lunch. So we're going to cut off the chunk of the Q&A or the plenary so that we can have a bumper plenary after lunch. We have 4 presenters after lunch, and then we can all sit down. I'll set out the chairs for all the speakers to come forward, the DG and so forth, and then we can thrash our issues towards them. So quick back and forth, and it'll allow us to have a break before we go for the cocktail set out for you this evening. So it's an intensive day, but we also have a cocktail later, which allows you to also network and further build the business relationships. So if that proposal is good, let us go with the next 2 presentations. And then we're going to be on time as we were off time. We'll come back in time and then proceed with the next 4, and then just have a big plenary where we are discussing the issues together. All right, I think we might have a bit more strength after that, maybe. Stay off the meat during lunch. You will come back more vibrant. That is scientifically proven, by the way. So allow me to proceed with the next presentations.
Mtazamaji wa Star TV ambao umekuwa nasi katika matangazo haya ya moja kwa moja tukiripoti kutoka katika ukumbi wa Malaika Beach Resort Ilemela jijini Mwanza. Na kikubwa zaidi katika kongamano kwa siku ya leo, tukiangalia uwekezaji katika biashara, lakini pia fursa mbalimbali zilizopo katika sekta ya usafirishaji kwa njia ya reli nchini Tanzania. Kongamano hili limewakutanisha wafanyabiashara kutoka maeneo mbalimbali ndani na nje ya nchi, na pia limewakutanisha wadau wengine wa sekta hii ya usafirishaji. Basi niseme kwamba kutoka katika kongamano hili la siku 2, maana yake kwamba litafanyika leo na kesho litakuwa ni hitimisho, hakuna la ziada. Kwa niaba ya timu nzima ambayo tumefanya nayo kazi kwa karibu kwa siku ya leo, Lavet Haguye, Paul Masahi, Emmanuel Makuliga, Victor Chacha, kule studio Ilemela jijini Mwanza wakiwepo Ana Chaz, pamoja na Andrew na wengine wote ambao tumekuwa nao katika matangazo haya moja kwa moja. Mimi naitwa Bernard James BJ. Asante na nikutakie utazamaji mzuri wa vipindi vinavyoendelea kutoka hapa Star TV.